So I will be the first to admit that disability issues and accessibility issues were not really on my radar all that much before I became a parent of a child with a disability. My professional background was working in international business development for a medical device company. And during that work, I spent a lot of time traveling around the world, dealing on cross-cultural communication teams and health system navigation and contract negotiation and regulatory issues and all those kinds of things. And while I was traveling, I was very frequently reliant on the kindness of strangers in other countries. So my way of trying to pay that forward a little bit was to be very active as a volunteer in our immigrant communities in Minnesota. So I did things like teach English as a second language classes. I taught citizenship classes, did volunteer work where I could. When my own child was diagnosed with autism, he was about 3 years old. My husband and I came into that work with every privilege a person could possibly have. We identify as white, we do not identify as disabled ourselves. English is our first language. My husband is an attorney. I had 20 years experience in health system navigation. Like we had all the cards and we couldn't make it work. We really, really struggled to get systems in place for our child and ran into, a lot of ableism and a lot of like dysfunctional systems and, just things were not working well for us. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, boy, if it's this hard for us, then what does this look like for families that don't speak English as their first language? What does this look like for cultural communities that don't use paperwork? What does this look like for communities that prioritize oral communication over written? How does this work out for them? So, fairly early on in my journey, I ended up running a support group for parents of autistic children. And I, asked the typical white lady question, which is how do we bring more diverse communities to us and improve, the diversity of our group? And I realized very early on that that was not the right question to be asking. The question that I should have been asking was, what's going on in our multicultural communities? What is their leadership prioritizing? What issues are they facing? How can I support their efforts? And I was really fortunate that I made some good friendships early on with people who were willing to show me a whole lot of grace and really educate me. The issues faced by families in my cultural community were not the same things that were being faced by families in the Somali community and the Oromo community. Where families were asking questions like, how do I avoid getting evicted from my home when my child is damaging property? How do I tell my spouse about my child's diagnosis when the stigma against disability is so strong in our community that I'm worried about getting divorced if my husband finds out that my child has a disability diagnosis? Families that are worried about, am I going to be reported to child protection services if I disclose that my 6-year-old is not toilet trained yet? So it was very, very different set of issues. And it really was a humbling moment for me to realize that the questions I was asking were not the right ones. And I just needed to sit back and listen a bit. So that's really how I got started on my advocacy journey. I just showed up one day and basically said, can I learn? Will you let me tag along and see if there's something that I can do that might be helpful to these families? But just let me learn, that their issues are not the same as my issues. And the things that they need help with are not the things that I need help with. But I might be able to, help build some bridges and assist some of these families with navigating the services that were so hard for me. I will say, we often hear this phrase about being a voice for the voiceless, and that is not what I aspire to under any circumstances. I think the question we need to be asking is, why is that person's voice not being heard? And how do we remove the barriers? Again, because of my privilege, because of the color of my skin and my educational background and, the fact that I grow up speaking English, I get invited to a lot of spaces. So I think it's really important to look around and be like, well, are the people who are going to be affected by this policy or whatever it is we're discussing actually here in the room? And if they're not, why not? What's keeping them out? So I make a point of, whenever I get invited to a hearing for this or a work group for that or a task force for the other thing, to bring people, with disabilities with me, to bring people from diverse communities with me, and to try and really be thoughtful about what are those barriers to access. Does this space feel safe? Is it accommodating? Are people's disabilities needs being met? Are we holding this meeting in a way that feels comfortable and accessible? And I think I mentioned when we spoke earlier, there's a beautiful piece of work by Dr. D.L. Lewis. I'm sorry, Dr. D.L. Stewart, that talks about, who's not in the room, who is not at the table, who didn't get invited, who's not being heard, and really being thoughtful about, making sure those voices are able to access conversations to policies which affect them.
In your experience, what are some things schools and community partners can do to work together to assure that diverse voices are heard?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We hear that a lot too, like, oh, we asked families what they thought, or we invited them to give us feedback, but they didn't, respond, or nobody showed up. And I will say my answer to that is always, if you are not hearing from people, it's not because they don't have anything to say. It's because we haven't done the work of approaching them in a way that feels safe or accessible. Um, so one example of this is we worked on an early childhood study not long ago for our Department of Education. And, people were sending out surveys, written online surveys, as is the very common way of engaging with families. Well, first of all, an online survey is not super accessible if you don't have very reliable internet access, or if your only access is through your phone and you have to kind of check the micro boxes and tiny font, and that's not a super easy way to do it. Secondly, if you come from an oral language community, again, a written survey is not going to be your preferred way to interact. So for our survey group, we didn't do any surveys at all. We did focus groups, and we had about 40 families attend a series of 4 different focus groups. And these are all families that we knew pretty well. We've been going to doctor's appointments with these families. We have a relationship with them. We know their kids. We hang out with their kids. And so for us, we were able to have a really honest, really in-depth, sometimes painfully so, conversation with these families about their experience of early childhood education. So I would say, if you are not hearing from that group, it's not because they don't have anything to say, it's because they haven't been approached in the right way, and there's more work that needs to be done. The school doesn't have that kind of relationship with families, find somebody who does, because I can guarantee you they're out there. That might be connecting with the mosque community, or connecting with a social group, or, connecting with some other kind of nonprofit organization, or connecting with a group that provides, parent training or something along those lines. But, there are groups out there that do have those relationships with parents, with culturally specific communities. And that can be a great way to kind of build a bridge to partner with someone who has that trust if it doesn't already exist. A collaborative process. It should be a collaborative process, and parents are a great resource. And I will say that that's even gotten to the point where, when there are bills being proposed, people will call our organization and say, has anybody asked MAAN what they think about this? Has anybody talked to multicultural communities to get their take on how this is going to affect them? And that's really nice to see that people are thinking like, oh, have we considered this point of view? Have we considered this perspective? And understanding that there's a lot of value to it, to have that parent voice